So, for millennia now, the church has celebrated in the calendar this season called Advent. And it is, in fact, different than Christmas. Christmas in the church calendar is its own thing. And believe it or not, there are 12 days of Christmas in the church calendar. Imagine that. But Advent is this season of expectation, of building hope, of anticipation that God might invade in a good way, the darkness of the world and make all things new again. Advent, at its core, tells us the story that God was not willing to simply sit in the coffers of heaven and look down on his creation in peril and distress and say, "Oh well, too bad." Instead, he was so mobilized by his love that he entered into the mess and the milieu of humanity in order that he might rescue and restore it. This is what Advent is. And many of the times the church celebrates this Advent season by reading or pondering on the birth stories of Jesus. And this is a wonderful thing to do. But I need to tell you that the Advent story is told repetitively throughout all of the scriptures. In fact, we read an Advent story from Isaiah chapter 9 way back when. And for the next couple of weeks, we're going to consider an interesting Advent story that is actually in one of the Apostle Paul's letters. The Apostle Paul wrote a letter to the church at Galatia. And at this church that Paul had some connection to, there was a central problem that was going on in the church. See, that church, as with many of the early churches, was incredibly diverse. And there were people of all different ethnicities and all different persuasions in that church. Particularly, there were what we would call Jewish people, right? People who had grown up, who had a lineage of Judaism, and for them, that was central to their identity. And then there were what we would call Gentiles. And Gentiles is just a Jewish way of saying everyone who's not Jewish, right? So you're Jewish or you're Gentile in an ancient Jewish way of thinking. And these Gentile people had no connection to Judaism. They may have known about it and understood some of the different parts, but it wasn't central or core to their identity. And now you have these Jewish people and these Gentile people who have all believed the gospel of Jesus and his death and resurrection and are gathered together in an emerging church now, and they're finding themselves struggling to understand the implications of the gospel. That is, there is a growing problem where Jewish people in that congregation are insisting that the Gentile people take on a Jewish identity, that they follow Jewish law and moral code, that they take on symbols and signs onto themselves, i.e. circumcision and feasts and things like that, of Jewish persuasion. And Paul is writing to them. This whole letter is targeted to answer that very problem. And he says, no. Those who are in Christ have a new identity. No one is going back to old identities. And at the crux of this argument, Paul tells a very brief Advent story that enlightens what Jesus has done. And over the next 3 weeks, including Christmas Eve, we are going to just kind of spend some time marinating in this story and seeing its implications for a diverse group like us. If you have a copy of the scriptures, you can turn to Galatians chapter 4. If not, no worries. We'll have it up on the screen for you as well. Galatians chapter 4, verse 1. We're going to read through verse 9. This is what it says. What I, that is Paul, what I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he is no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, the heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So, just to kind of clue you into what's going on here, because we've jumped into this letter in the midst of an analogy. And Paul is suggesting that Jewish people are like underage heirs, that the law has been a guardian for them. Their Jewish identity has been a guardian for them to move them towards adulthood when they can have the full expression of connection to God. Make sense? Kind of, sort of? That's all you need, right? Verse 3, so also when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. What on earth is that? We're going to talk about that. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not God's. But now that you know God, or rather that you are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? Word of God for the people of God. The question we want to answer this morning, and I get it, there's many questions in this text, that's why we've got 3 weeks, okay? So we'll get to many of the questions. The central question we want to answer this morning as we launch into this Advent season is, what kind of world did Jesus enter? What kind of world did Jesus enter? And Paul kind of puts that on full display in these verses here. And singularly, he says in verse 3, you might remember this, that they were in slavery to the elemental spiritual forces of the world. Strange phrase, isn't it? And if you have a different version of the Bible, my guess is it's translated differently. Because in the original language, stoika to kosmu, right? This to kosmu we get of the world. But stoika, elemental spiritual forces, is one single word in the original language. And your translation might say different because it's strange, it's odd. And in fact, you have to do some reading in the contemporary world of Paul to get a sense of what this word actually means. It almost means like basic things. Or to put it in sort of modern educational vernacular, the ABCs, right? You got to know the ABCs before you can read and write and do these things. And Paul's saying you had these things, but they've actually enslaved you now. That is, we could probably say it this way to make it more understandable for us. That the world that Jesus came into had let lesser things become ultimate things. Does it make sense? These building block things that were always meant to point to the ultimate had now become for them the ultimate. And so they are enslaved to it. Now listen, whenever we hear the word slavery, our modern sensibilities are triggered a little bit because we understand the moral corruption, depravity, heaviness, ick, whatever you want to call it, to that term. And I say to you, good, stay there. Because Paul intends for us to feel that way at some level. To be enslaved in the early era of this country is certainly a horrific thing. But to be enslaved in Paul's day, while there was various forms of it, was also a heavy and broken thing. And so Paul does not use this language simply. He's intending to bring with it heavy analogy while also understanding this idea of forced into service. Does this make sense? That is, that we have allowed ourselves collectively, or the people that Paul was writing to prior to Jesus, the world prior to the arrival of Jesus, had allowed itself to be forced into service of lesser things instead of the ultimate thing. Are we tracking with? Are we making sense of this? Now we have to remember, because Paul's speaking to two different groups at the same time, and you can almost sense it and hear it if you can kind of catch it as we're going along here. It's like he's beginning by talking to Jewish people about the law, and then all of a sudden he's talking about idols and things like that, and it's like he's talking to Gentile people. And that's exactly what he's doing. He's necessarily trying to put them both in the same pot, as it were, and say, listen, no matter what your background was, we were actually all, and Paul purposely uses the first person plural pronoun we. He includes himself in it, right? We were actually all in the same mess. So let's just take just a couple of minutes to understand the plight of Jewish people and of Gentile people upon the arrival of Jesus. Let's start with Jewish people. Paul says they were enslaved to the elemental forces of the world. And what he necessarily means, because it's what he's been talking about, for them is their Jewish identity or the law. Listen, when sometimes, many times, especially Paul, when he uses the language, the law, the Torah, he does not necessarily mean the Ten Commandments. He's speaking to it of a marker of identity to all that is Judaism. So again, he would not be telling Christians, oh, yeah, you have a new identity in Jesus, therefore you can murder and commit adultery, and who cares about your parents, and yada, 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 right? He's saying to them pretty graphically in Galatians, hey, just because you're a man and you've come to faith in Jesus, that does not mean you have to go get circumcised, right? He's talking about these big markers of Judaism, one of which was Torah obedience. Paul says, you're actually enslaved to that thing. Strong language, isn't it? Because if you have any familiarity with the Old Testament, the Torah was front and center. Jewish identity was front and center. So where does Paul get off making these statements? Well, remember that Paul defines himself in other letters, and we know it from the book of Acts as well, as kind of the Jew of Jews, right? In other words, like, you want to talk about someone who was all about ethnic identity? That was Paul. Who owned his identity as his true value? That was Paul. Who said he kept the law perfectly? That was Paul's language. So he has come to an understanding from his meeting the resurrected Jesus that something shifts here. That at some level, the law actually was a lesser thing. Jewish identity actually was a lesser thing. Circumcision actually was a lesser thing that was always meant to point towards an ultimate thing. And somewhere along the way, the people got caught up so much in the lesser thing that they began missing the bigger thing. Does it make sense? So think about this with me. You're familiar with the Exodus story, I imagine, at some level. The Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt. They are rescued from their slavery. How? By God coming, by God's advent into their midst, correct? In order to save them. Through miraculous things, he puts off the Pharaoh of Egypt, and the people are saved. And the people go out into the desert, and they make it to Mount Sinai. And what happens at Mount Sinai? If you can make it that far into the Ten Commandments, we're about 3 to 4 hours into the movie by that point, right? It's at Mount Sinai that God then gives them their Jewish identity, the law and the Torah. It's super important, friends, to remember that rescue happens before law, doesn't it? And law is not the thing that rescues them. God rescues them. So why does he give them the Torah and a Jewish identity? To point them to his rescue and to call them his people. And so that they might live in a way as a society that both honors and reflects him, as well as is able to dwell in some level of proximity to him, even though he's distant behind temple doors and heavy curtains. That's the purpose of the law. That's why it's there. The law is a very good and gracious gift of God. Jewish identity is an incredibly good and gracious gift of God so that his people will always know that they belong to him. But over time, as happens with all kinds of religion, including modern-day Protestant Christianity, people begin to simply go through the motions and forget that religion points to something and actually is not ultimate. And so what happens, Paul reflects back on, is that for the Jewish people, the law actually becomes a thing that exposes their true problem. That they have hearts that actually don't want to glorify God, don't want to live God's way. So they can, at their very best, keep the law, while not allowing it to point them to God. And at their very worst, say, who gives a heck, crap, whatever you want to say, about the law? I'm going to do whatever I want. And if you read the Old Testament, you see both of those things in full view. And so you have God calling the prophets to say to the people, I hate your sacrifices and I hate your feasts. Now, those are the very things that God called them to do. Why would he say that? Because they're just doing them in order to maintain an identity, not to have an identity because of their connection to God himself. Does this make sense? And so it ultimately leads the height, the unfortunate negative height of the Old Testament is Israel sent into exile. Why? Because the law cannot save them. It cannot rescue them from themselves. And even as they come back from exile, and they're hoping that God will again come and be amongst them, and there is a major messianic hope emerging amongst the people, for those kind of in the heights of Jewish religion, they are pointing once again to the law and their Jewish identity as the means by which God will come back and rescue them. This is exactly why the Pharisees can't see Jesus for who he is, and why Jesus seems to only get really angry at one particular group, the Pharisees. Right? Because they have missed the boat. They've allowed themselves to be enslaved by the lesser thing that was always meant to point towards the bigger thing. They are looking to their religious identity for hope and life and rescue. And it can't do any of those things. Then there are the Gentiles, right? Who have no covenant with God, who have no outward markers that they belong to Him. And yet all of creation is God's. And we need to remember this, friends, that the truth of Advent is that God has come to rescue the cosmos, not just a handful, right? Because all of the world is God's. And Paul turns and says to them, yeah, you're not enslaved by this law thing or this identity thing. You've got a whole other problem over here. It's that you understand inherently that you don't have within you what you need for true life, for ultimate protection, for the rescue you inherently know you need. And so where do you look for it? You look to all kinds of created things in order to find it. And so in the ancient world, that's what they did. They made idols, right? And so gods were made over anything and everything in the world, right? Anything you can think about that would have existed in the days of Jesus, there probably was an idol and a god towards it. So much so that there was even gods in the Greco-Roman world towards things like luck. There was a god of luck, right? Because they know they need all of these things. They know they have to look outside of themselves, and yet they are enslaved and entrapped by lesser things instead of letting the lesser things in the inner drive move them towards the ultimate thing. Now, of course, the Jewish people are partly to blame too, because a big part of their mission was to show the Gentiles who God was by how they lived. And they were messing that up too, right? And so there's this whole big pot. Listen, here's what I need to say to you. In the very same way that the world was enslaved when Jesus showed up, it remains enslaved today. Look at our world. Look at it. We can almost define it with two giant categories, can't we? And if we wanted to, we could call them prototypical first century Jewish people and prototypical first century Gentile people, but that would probably be inappropriate and probably wrongly appropriating. So let's say religious people and irreligious people. And what are both of them doing? Looking to lesser things instead of the ultimate thing for life, for protection, for contentment, for rescue. Listen, in the church today, capital C, and my guess is even lowercase c in our midst, there are plenty of people who are wrongly placing their hope in their Christian identity. Right? That is, because I was born a Christian, because I take on the cultural position of Christian, because I engage in my Christian religious practices, then and therefore I have hope that God can do what He needs to do with me. And I say to you, your hope is in the wrong place. Christian religion is good and beautiful, but it is a lesser thing that is meant to point us always toward the ultimate thing. Should you come to church and read your Bible and live a certain way? Of course you should, but only as so much as it points you toward the ultimate thing, that is that you're glorifying God, not self. I wonder this morning how many of us find ourselves enslaved to religion. You may say, well, I've already dealt with that and I've found full hope in Jesus, and I say, praise God, for that, but as long as we live in the already not yet, remember, we are also still waiting for a final advent, the second coming of Jesus. As long as we wait for that, we will continue to be ensnared and enslaved to other things as well. I mean, what is your story? Where are you honestly looking to for hope, for life, for rescue, for protection? Is God, quote unquote, on your side because you've done all the things? Or is God for you because that's who God is? One is religion, one is gospel, and they're very different kinds of hopes. The first one will enslave you in one of two ways, correct? Either you will become a legalist, and what we mean by that is you will start counting and accumulating all of your religious actions and looking at other people down your nose in condescension for their lack of a religious resume. And you will then be attempting to show that to God and tell him he's got to be for you. That sounds like slavery to me. That you are under the microscope every single second of every single day. You better not mess up that resume. What you believe and who you're trying to be will always determine how you behave and how you order your lives. If your identity is a religious identity, you will be enslaved to it. You will serve it. You will be chained to it. It will lord itself over you in a life-sucking way. And for some of you, that's at least part of your story. And Jesus enters into that. For others, our story is a little bit more like the irreligious side of things. And again, you can sit in church and you can be a wild and moral probably don't go together, right? A strongly moral, whatever adjective you want to use, a super moral person, right? And still struggle with idolatry. Because idolatry is just as rampant today as it was in the first century world of Jesus. We've just grown as a society, you might say, enough that we don't fashion images to represent them anymore. We just worship them without the images. You don't need the image for it to be an idol. What does Paul say idols are? He says they're the things that are not God's, right? I think that's verse 8 or verse 9 of Galatians 4 there. So anything or idea that you are glorifying that is not God, that is not divine, is an idol. And so while we might not make statues to help us in war or farming or for luck or for family, as the ancients did, there are many things that we look to insisting that we need them in order to have full life, to experience true rescue, or to be completely safe and secure. And any of those things have the opportunity to become idols in your life. And idols are almost always really good things that are meant to point us to an ultimate thing that we have wrongly elevated. Money, relationships, material things, earthly status, vocation, The list goes on and on and on again. Think with me for just a second. How would you answer this question? If I only had blank, I'd be satisfied. If I just had blank, my life would be full. There's a good chance whatever you put in there has the opportunity to become an idol in your life. How do you know that it rises to the level of idolatry? Because you begin serving it. Right? It's not just something you look to and hope for. It's something you want to be, and therefore you get in service towards it, and you'll do almost anything to get it. It owns you. You're chained to it. You can't escape it. In fact, I think Paul is being so bold as to suggest that the thing that unites religious and irreligious people together is that they're both idolaters. One just puts religious things as idol, while the other just puts created things or life needs there. And this is the world that Jesus enters. Do you hear Paul's words? At just the right time. Incredible. Rach and I have been watching the show Chicago PD. Anyone ever watched it before? Rach kind of likes crime and police shows, and so I kind of get hooked on them too, and we're catching up. We're not current. But one of the things that we were watching it last night before we paused to watch Penn State brutally fall. Sorry, I just wanted you to have to mourn with me. One of the things I was realizing in that show is no matter where these special police officers are, they just so happen to be a crime that's happening right near them. And they're there at just the right time to step in and to deal with that situation. I was thinking about that. Like, this is Paul's language. At just the right time when the chains were choking you, the chains were choking me, either of our religious idols or our irreligious idols. At just the right time, Jesus shows up. He happens to be there. And of course, we know he doesn't just happen to be there. This is a God who loves you so pervasively that he knows the exact right time to show up. And Jesus steps into this mess. Listen to me. He necessarily enslaves himself to that which does not enslave him. Right? That's deep theological language. It does not enslave him because he lives without sin, but he allows himself to be enslaved by the mess of this world. Why? So that he could rescue us. It's like people being sentenced to life in prison and having God himself get arrested so that he could launch a jailbreak. My guess is you've never experienced that kind of love. That kind of lay your life down reality of love. This Advent, I plead with you to remember the world in which Jesus entered, and to realize that a God who stands outside of time was not just entering the perfect moment of the first century world. He was entering the perfect moment of everyone's experience of slavery to darkness, so that he might light up the world, uncuff and unbind you, and point you towards the thing that can actually give you the full life, the rescue, and the protection that your soul longs for. That's what Advent is. And Jesus is the only one who can do it. Plan to be with us next Sunday when we ask the question, why is Jesus perfectly situated to be our rescuer? Paul says, born of a woman, born under the law. He knows exactly what he's saying when he says it. And we're going to ask that question together. You pray with me? God, as Western Americans, we tend to want to think that we are free. Free to do and be who we want. But we are living lies. None of us are free. We are actually bound, enslaved, forced into service. Unless and until we understand the depth of the darkness into which Jesus entered, we will resist his offer of rescue unto freedom. God, if there are those amongst us or who will listen to this in some way at some point further, who have never honestly considered the truth of the gospel before, that they are broken, in chains, enslaved to sin, unable to rescue themselves, looking and hoping to all kinds of things, but Paul calls these idols weak and miserable. I pray that in this moment they would see you for who you truly are. Not the one who has chained them, but the one who has come to set them free. That they would give you their heart and their allegiance. For those who would already call themselves followers of Jesus, I pray that this Advent would, anew and afresh, give us opportunity to see all of the places, or at least some, where we're still chained up a little bit, where we're still wrongly bound, where we are allowing ourselves to be enslaved and forced into service. And that we would turn to Jesus afresh and anew, certain that in that situation or circumstance or compartment of life and true freedom are only found in him. God, we praise you for your love for us, that at just the right time, you arrived into our mess that we might be set free. That you came into darkness to illuminate a path to freedom. And we praise you for it. In your name, amen.